The sound of shovels biting into hard-packed earth echoed across the prairie like a death song. Margaret Hartwell stood at the edge of Silverbrook's newest cemetery. If you could call a hastily dug field of shallow graves a cemetery. The morning sun cast long shadows over the wooden crosses that marked where neighbors, friends, and family members had been laid to rest in the past 3 weeks. 27 graves and counting. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, wincing as the coarse fabric brushed against the angry red pustules that dotted her neck and arms. The scars on her left cheek had begun to heal, leaving behind a patchwork of pink skin that would mark her forever as a survivor of the plague that was consuming their frontier town. "Miss Margaret," young Billy Thompson's voice cracked as he stumbled toward her, his face flushed with fever, his small hands clutching a blood-stained cloth. Behind him, two more men carried a wrapped body toward the growing field of graves. "Is it true what they're saying?" Billy gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "That Dr. Webb's really gone? That he ain't coming back?" Margaret's jaw tightened. 3 days ago, Dr. Marcus Webb had loaded his medical bag, his personal belongings, and what remained of the town's medical supplies onto the last healthy horse in Silverbrook. He'd claimed he was riding to Fort Laramie for reinforcements and medicine. But everyone knew the truth. He was running. "Dr. Webb has gone to seek help," she said carefully, placing a gentle hand on Billy's burning forehead. The boy was no more than 12, and she could feel the fever raging beneath his skin like a furnace. "My ma's getting worse," Billy whispered, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. "She can't keep nothing down, and the sores, they're spreading something fierce. What are we going to do without the doctor?" Margaret looked beyond Billy toward the town that had once bustled with 340 souls. Now barely half that number remained conscious enough to care for the sick. The others lay in darkened cabins, burning with fever, their bodies covered in the telltale pustules that marked smallpox's deadly grip. She'd seen this plague before, 2 years ago when it swept through her hometown of Independence. She'd watched her younger brother waste away, despite everything the doctors tried. She'd held her mother's hand as the life drained from her eyes, and she'd learned, in those dark weeks, that there were some battles that conventional medicine simply couldn't win. "We'll find a way," she told Billy, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "We always do." But as she watched another body being lowered into the unforgiving earth, Margaret wondered if this time there might not be a way at all. The sound of hoofbeats made her turn. Sheriff Davies rode up on his remaining horse, the only other animal in town that hadn't been sacrificed for meat or fled in terror. His face was gaunt, his badge hanging loose on his shrunken frame. "Margaret," he called out, dismounting with obvious effort. "Town council's meeting at sundown. What's left of us anyway? We need to make some decisions about what comes next." "What kind of decisions?" Davies glanced around nervously, as if the very words he was about to speak might invoke more disaster. "Whether we abandon Silverbrook, pack up whatever's left and try to make it to Fort Laramie before—" He gestured helplessly at the field of graves. "Before we all end up here," Margaret finished quietly. "The thing is," Davies continued, lowering his voice, "we got word yesterday from a trader passing through. Says there's been reports of unusual activity near the river. Native war party, maybe, or worse." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. In their weakened state, the remaining townspeople would be defenseless against any kind of attack. But the thought of abandoning the only home she'd known for the past 5 years, of leaving behind everyone who'd already died here, felt like a betrayal of their memory. "There's got to be another way," she said. Davies shook his head sadly. "Doc Webb took all the real medicine with him. All we got left is prayer and whatever home remedies folks remember their grandmothers using against something like this." He gestured toward Billy, who had collapsed onto the ground, his small body racked with violent coughing. As Margaret knelt beside the boy, trying to comfort him with words she didn't believe, she couldn't help but think about the stories her grandmother used to tell. Stories of the old days, when frontier folk had to rely on more than just conventional medicine to survive. Stories of unlikely alliances forged in desperate times. Stories of salvation coming from the most unexpected places. When the doctor fled and half the town lay dying, Margaret Hartwell had no idea that salvation would come from the man they'd been taught to fear most. She had no idea that within days, everything she thought she knew about healing, about survival, and about the people they called enemies would change forever. But as another shovelful of dirt hit another makeshift grave, one thing became crystal clear. If Silverbrook was going to survive, they would need a miracle. And sometimes miracles came wearing war paint. 3 days earlier, Margaret had watched Dr. Marcus Webb pack his leather medical bag with the methodical precision of a man who had already decided his patient's fate. The morning sun streamed through the windows of what had once been Silverbrook's pride, a proper medical clinic with real glass windows shipped all the way from St. Louis, surgical instruments that gleamed like silver, and shelves lined with bottles of laudanum, quinine, and mercury compounds that had cost the town a small fortune. Now those same shelves stood nearly empty. "You can't take everything," Margaret said from the doorway, her voice barely above a whisper. She'd come to beg him to examine little Sarah Mitchell, whose fever had spiked so high the night before that her mother was convinced the child would be dead by morning. Dr. Webb didn't look up from his packing. He was a thin man in his 50s, with perfectly groomed whiskers and soft hands that had never known the calluses of frontier life. He'd come to Silverbrook 2 years ago with promises of bringing civilization to the wilderness, of establishing a medical practice that would serve settlements up and down the Missouri River. "I'm taking what I paid for," he said curtly, wrapping his precious stethoscope in velvet cloth. "The town owes me 3 months' wages, and considering I'll likely never see another cent of it, I'd say I'm being more than generous leaving anything behind." "People are dying, Marcus. People die everywhere, Margaret. That's the natural order of things." He finally looked at her, and she was shocked by the fear she saw in his eyes. "You think I don't know what this is? I've read the reports from St. Louis, from Kansas City. This isn't just any fever. This is smallpox, and it's the most virulent strain I've ever encountered." Margaret felt her stomach drop. She'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by the town's only trained physician made it real in a way that chilled her to the bone. "All the more reason to stay," she said desperately. "These people trusted you. They paid good money to bring you here because they believed in fairy tales." Webb snapped, slamming his medical bag shut. "They thought having a doctor in town would protect them from the realities of frontier life. Well, here's a reality for you. There is no cure for smallpox. There is no treatment that works. The mortality rate in confined populations like this ranges from 30 to 70%, and all the medical training in the world won't change that." He moved to his desk and began stuffing important papers into a leather satchel. "I've seen what this disease does, Margaret. I've seen entire families wiped out in a matter of days. I've seen grown men reduced to weeping children begging for death. And I've learned that sometimes the kindest thing a doctor can do is admit defeat." "So you're just going to abandon them?" "I'm going to Fort Laramie to get help. Real help. The Army has access to vaccines, to proper quarantine facilities. The nearest Army post is 5 days hard riding, and that's if you don't run into hostile Indians or get lost on the prairie." Margaret stepped closer, desperation making her bold. "Half these people will be dead before you even reach the fort, assuming you make it there alive." Dr. Webb's face hardened. "That's a risk I'm willing to take, because staying here means certain death for me and for everyone else." He shouldered his bags and moved toward the door, but Margaret blocked his path. "What about your oath?" she demanded. "What about first, do no harm?" For a moment something flickered in Webb's eyes. Shame, perhaps, or regret. But it was quickly replaced by cold determination. "Sometimes, Miss Hartwell, the greatest harm a doctor can do is give people false hope." He gently but firmly moved her aside. "I suggest you use whatever time you have left to make peace with your maker." Margaret watched through the clinic window as Dr. Webb loaded his belongings onto his horse, the strongest, healthiest animal left in town. Mrs. Patterson emerged from her cabin across the street, cradling her infant son against her chest. The baby's cries were weak and pitiful, barely audible even in the morning stillness. "Doctor," Mrs. Patterson called out, stumbling toward him. "Please, it's little James. He's burning up, and I don't know what to do." Webb didn't even pause. He swung up into his saddle and spurred his horse forward, riding past the desperate mother without so much as a glance in her direction. "Please." Mrs. Patterson's voice cracked as she tried to run after him. "He's just a baby." But Dr. Marcus Webb was already disappearing into the distance, leaving behind nothing but dust and the sound of a mother's anguished sobs. Margaret felt something die inside her chest as she watched the last hope of professional medical help vanish into the prairie. She'd seen doctors before who cared more about money than patients, but she'd never encountered such complete abandonment of human decency. She walked slowly to where Mrs. Patterson had collapsed in the street, still clutching her feverish child. "Come on, Helen," Margaret said softly, helping the woman to her feet. "Let's get you and James back inside where it's cool." "What are we going to do, Margaret?" Helen whispered, tears streaming down her face. "What are we going to do without a doctor?" It was a question Margaret couldn't answer. She'd helped deliver babies and set broken bones, had learned basic nursing from her mother, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for a full-blown epidemic. The medical books Dr. Webb had left behind might as well have been written in ancient Greek for all the good they would do her. As she helped Helen back to her cabin, Margaret noticed more signs of the town's rapid decline. The Johanssons' chickens had escaped their coop and were wandering freely through the streets. No one had the strength to chase them down. The blacksmith's forge sat cold and silent. Even the saloon, usually the liveliest spot in town, stood shuttered and dark. By her count, at least 30 people had already died. Another 40 or 50 were bedridden with fever and the characteristic pustules that marked smallpox's progress. That left maybe 70 people who were still healthy enough to function, and many of them were already showing early symptoms. At this rate, Silverbrook would be a ghost town within a month. That evening, the surviving members of the town council gathered in what remained of the general store. Sheriff Davies, Mayor Hutchins, and the Reverend Pike sat around a makeshift table, their faces gaunt and hollow in the flickering candlelight. Margaret had been invited to attend as the closest thing they had to medical expertise, a designation that would have been laughable under any other circumstances. "Options are limited," Mayor Hutchins said without preamble. He was a large man who had lost at least 30 pounds in the past 3 weeks, his clothes hanging loose on his diminished frame. "We can try to ride to Fort Laramie and hope the army takes us in, or we can hunker down here and pray the plague burns itself out before it kills us all." "The army won't take infected civilians," Sheriff Davies pointed out. "They'd shoot us before they'd let us near their stockade." "Then what do you suggest?" Reverend Pike asked. His voice was hoarse from conducting too many funeral services. "We sit here and wait to die." "There might be another option," Margaret said quietly. All three men turned to look at her with expressions ranging from skeptical to desperate. "I've been thinking about the stories my grandmother used to tell," she continued, "about the early settlers. Before there were doctors and proper medicine, they had to rely on other methods." "What kind of other methods?" Mayor Hutchins asked. Margaret took a deep breath. "Folk remedies, herbal treatments, traditional healing practices that the Indians have been using for centuries." The silence that followed was deafening. "You're talking about savage medicine," Sheriff Davies said finally. "Witchcraft and superstition." "I'm talking about survival," Margaret replied firmly. "My grandmother swore that willow bark tea could bring down a fever. She used to make poultices from certain plants that would heal wounds faster than anything the town doctor could provide. And she learned most of it from an old Cheyenne woman who traded with the settlement." "That's blasphemy," Reverend Pike said, his face flushed with indignation. "God sent this plague as a test of our faith. Turning to heathen practices would be practical," Margaret interrupted. "Reverend, I respect your faith, but your prayers haven't stopped people from dying. Maybe it's time to consider that God helps those who help themselves." Mayor Hutchins leaned forward, suddenly interested. "You know any of these remedies?" "Some, but not enough." Margaret paused, knowing her next words would likely get her thrown out of the meeting. "We'd need help from someone who really understands traditional healing, someone with generations of knowledge passed down through their people." "You're talking about Indians," Sheriff Davies said flatly. "I'm talking about people who know how to treat diseases that white medicine can't cure." The three men exchanged glances, and Margaret could see the internal struggle playing out on their faces. Everything they'd been taught told them that Indians were enemies, savages, threats to be eliminated or avoided. But everything they were witnessing told them that conventional solutions had already failed. "There have been reports," Sheriff Davies said slowly. "Traders coming through say there's a small band camping near the river, about 5 miles east of here. Lakota, from what they can tell." "Lakota?" Reverend Pike's voice went up an octave. "Those are the same savages who've been raiding settlements up and down the Missouri." "Maybe," Davies said. "Or maybe they're just trying to survive, same as us." Mayor Hutchins was quiet for a long moment, staring at the guttering candle in the center of the table. Finally, he looked up at Margaret. "If, and I mean if, we were to consider such a thing, how would we even approach them? We can't exactly ride into their camp and ask for help. They'd probably scalp us before we could explain what we wanted." Margaret felt her heart start to race. She hadn't expected them to take her suggestions seriously, but now that they were actually considering it, the enormity of what she was proposing began to sink in. "Someone would have to go alone," she said quietly. "Someone who poses no threat. Someone desperate enough to risk everything for a chance at saving the people they love." She looked around the table at the three men, seeing her own desperation reflected in their hollow eyes. "Someone like me." Margaret left Silverbrook before dawn, when the morning mist still clung to the prairie grass like the ghosts of the dead. She'd told no one of her plan, not Sheriff Davies, not Mayor Hutchins, and certainly not Reverend Pike, who would have locked her in the church before allowing her to seek help from godless savages. The scarred mare she rode had belonged to old Tom Bradley before the fever took him 3 days ago. The animal was past her prime, but she was steady and quiet. Qualities Margaret valued more than speed as she made her way toward the Missouri River. She'd packed light, a water skin, some hardtack, her father's old Navy Colt, and a small pouch of coins, the last of her savings in case the Indians wanted to trade. Everything she knew about negotiating with Native Americans came from stories told around frontier fires, most of them probably lies designed to frighten children. But what choice did she have? As the sun climbed higher, the reality of what she was attempting began to settle in her stomach like a cold stone. She was a single white woman, riding alone into territory where a Lakota war party had been spotted less than a week ago. Even if they didn't kill her outright, there was no guarantee they would understand what she wanted, much less agree to help. But when she thought of little Billy Thompson's fever-bright eyes, of Mrs. Patterson's dying baby, of the growing field of graves behind Silverbrook, she urged the mare forward. The river came into view around midday, a brown ribbon of water cutting through the endless grassland. Margaret could smell the moisture in the air, could hear the gentle murmur of current over stones. She followed the bank eastward, scanning the landscape for any sign of human presence. She found it an hour later, thin wisps of smoke rising from a grove of cottonwood trees about a mile ahead. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached, every instinct screaming at her to turn around and ride back to the safety of town. But safety was an illusion now. Silverbrook was dying, and she might be its only hope. Margaret dismounted while still hidden in the tall grass, and crept forward on foot, leading the mare behind her. Through the trees, she could make out the shapes of several hide lodges arranged in a loose circle. Horses grazed peacefully nearby, and she could see figures moving between the structures. Men, women, children living their lives in apparent tranquility. They didn't look like the bloodthirsty warriors from frontier stories. They looked like people. Margaret was so focused on the camp that she didn't notice the man behind her until he spoke. "You are far from your people, white woman." She spun around with a gasp, her hand automatically reaching for the pistol at her hip. A tall Lakota warrior stood not 10 feet away, having appeared as silently as morning mist. He was perhaps 40 years old, with long black hair braided with feathers and small bones. His face was painted with simple patterns in red and white, and he wore traditional buckskin clothing decorated with intricate beadwork. But it was his eyes that stopped her from drawing her weapon. They were dark and intelligent, studying her with careful attention rather than hostility. And there was something else there, a sadness that seemed to echo her own. Margaret's voice came out as a croak. She swallowed hard and tried again. "I come seeking help." The warrior tilted his head slightly, and she realized he might not understand English. She began to panic, wondering how she could possibly communicate her desperate need across the barrier of language and culture. "Your people are sick," he said finally, his English heavily accented but clear. Margaret blinked in surprise. You speak our language?" "I spent 2 winters at Fort Laramie, learning the white man's words." His expression remained neutral, giving no hint of whether he considered this a good thing or not. "I am called Tall Bear, and you are the woman who tends the sick in the wooden lodge settlement." "How do you know that?" "Traders speak of many things when they think no one is listening. They speak of the spotted death that has come to your people. They speak of the medicine man who ran away when his healing failed." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. Even the Indians knew about Dr. Webb's cowardice. "That's why I'm here," she said, forcing herself to meet his steady gaze. "My people are dying. Our medicine, it doesn't work against this sickness. But I've heard that your people have healing knowledge that goes back many generations." Tall Bear was quiet for so long that Margaret began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain. "The spotted death came to my people many seasons ago. It killed my wife, my children, my parents, half of all the Lakota who lived along the Great River." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "Your people's medicine men did nothing to help us then?" Margaret felt a stab of shame so sharp it was almost physical. "I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry for your loss." "Words are wind," Tall Bear said quietly. "But you tend the sick even when your own medicine man runs like a rabbit. This says something about your spirit." He began walking toward the camp, not looking back to see if she followed. After a moment's hesitation, Margaret grabbed her mare's reins and hurried after him. The camp was larger than it had appeared from a distance. Perhaps 50 people, ranging from elderly grandmothers to children barely old enough to walk. They stared at Margaret with open curiosity rather than fear or hostility, though she noticed that several of the younger men kept their hands near their weapons. Tall Bear led her to the largest lodge, where an elderly woman sat grinding something in a stone bowl. Her hair was white as winter snow, and her face was lined with the intricate patterns of a long life lived in the sun and wind. When she looked up at Margaret, her eyes were sharp and alert despite her obvious age. Tall Bear spoke to her in rapid Lakota, gesturing toward Margaret and then toward the west, where Silverbrook lay dying in the distance. The old woman listened carefully, occasionally asking questions that Margaret couldn't understand. Finally, the elderly woman set down her grinding stone and struggled to her feet. She approached Margaret slowly, studying her face with the same careful attention that Tall Bear had shown. Without warning, she reached out and touched Margaret's cheek, running her fingers over the scars left by the smallpox pustules. Margaret flinched but forced herself to remain still. The woman spoke to Tall Bear, who nodded gravely. "Grandmother's singing bird says you carry the marks of the spotted death, but it did not claim you," Tall Bear translated. "She says this means your spirit is strong, strong enough to help others fight the sickness." "Can you help us?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Grandmother's singing bird spoke again, and Tall Bear's expression grew troubled. "She says the healing plants that fight the spotted death are powerful, but they must be used with great care. To give this knowledge to white people, it could be dangerous." "Dangerous how?" Tall Bear was quiet for a moment, clearly wrestling with something internal. "If we heal your people, and they grow strong again, what is to stop them from driving us from our lands? What is to stop them from forgetting the debt they owe?" Margaret felt the weight of history pressing down on her. All the broken treaties, all the betrayals, all the reasons these people had to distrust her. But she also thought of little Billy Thompson, of Mrs. Patterson's baby, of all the people back in Silverbrook who were counting on her, even though they didn't know it. "I can't speak for all white people," she said finally. "I can only speak for myself. But I swear to you, on my mother's grave, that if you help us, I will never forget it, and I will make sure others remember too." Grandmother Singing Bird had been watching Margaret's face during this exchange, and now she spoke again, a longer speech that seemed to carry great weight. Tall Bear listened carefully, then nodded slowly. "Grandmother says she has seen many white people in her long life. Most of them look at us with fear or hatred. But you look at us with hope. She says hope is a powerful medicine, but it must be mixed with action to have any healing power. He paused, studying Margaret's face intently. She will help you, but there are conditions. You must learn to prepare the medicines yourself. She will not simply give them to you. You must understand why they work and how they must be used. And you must swear that this knowledge will be shared, not hoarded like the white medicine men do with their secrets. Margaret's heart leaped with desperate relief. Yes, she said quickly. Whatever you ask, I'll do it. Then we begin now, Tall Bear said. But first you must understand something important. These medicines will not save everyone. The spotted death is strong, and it has already taken hold in your people. Some will die no matter what we do. But some will live? For the first time since she'd met him, Tall Bear's expression softened slightly. Some will live, and sometimes that is enough. He led her to a smaller lodge where bundles of dried plants hung from the wooden frame like aromatic curtains. The air was thick with the scent of sage, sweetgrass, and herbs Margaret couldn't identify. First, we treat your own scars, Tall Bear said, gathering several bundles and beginning to sort through them. The spotted death leaves poison in the skin. Until that poison is drawn out, you cannot properly heal others. He began mixing something in a wooden bowl, dried leaves, powdered bark, and what looked like ground roots. As he worked, he explained each ingredient in careful English, making sure she understood not just what each plant was, but where it could be found and how it should be prepared. This is willow bark, he said, holding up a strip of reddish-brown bark. It fights the fire of fever, but it must be prepared exactly right, or it becomes poison instead of medicine. Margaret watched his hands with intense concentration, memorizing every detail of the process. This knowledge could mean the difference between life and death for everyone in Silverbrook. When the mixture was ready, Tall Bear dipped a soft piece of doe skin into the bowl and began gently applying it to the scars on Margaret's face. The moment it touched her skin, she felt a cool, tingling sensation that seemed to draw out the lingering pain and inflammation. How long will it take to learn all of this? She asked. For you to learn enough to help your people? 3 days, if you have the gift for healing that I think you do. He paused in his work to meet her eyes. But to truly understand the medicine path, that takes a lifetime. Margaret closed her eyes and let the healing balm work its magic on her scarred skin. For the first time in weeks, she dared to hope that Silverbrook might yet be saved. Then let's begin with 3 days, she said quietly, and see where the path leads from there. Margaret returned to Silverbrook as the sun was setting, her saddlebags filled with carefully wrapped bundles of herbs, and her mind racing with everything Tall Bear had taught her in their first session. The willow bark tea for fever, the echinacea root to strengthen the body's defenses, the golden seal for infection. Most importantly, the pine needle extract that Grandmother Singing Bird claimed could prevent the smallpox pustules from spreading. She'd spent the entire day learning to identify, prepare, and combine these traditional medicines under Tall Bear's patient guidance. Her hands still tingled from the healing balm he'd applied to her scars, and she could swear the angry red marks on her face had already begun to fade. But the real test would come tonight. Sheriff Davies was waiting for her at the edge of town, his gaunt face creased with worry and suspicion. "Where the hell have you been, Margaret?" he demanded as she dismounted. "People have been looking for you all day. Mrs. Patterson's baby took a turn for the worse, and young Billy Thompson," he shook his head grimly, "boy's asking for you specifically. Keep saying you promised to find help." Margaret's heart clenched. She'd been so focused on learning from Tall Bear that she'd almost forgotten the urgency of the situation back home. Every hour of delay meant more suffering, possibly more deaths. "I found help," she said quietly, shouldering her saddlebags. Davy's eyes narrowed. "What kind of help?" "The kind that works," Margaret replied, walking past him toward the center of town. "Gather whoever's still healthy enough to move. Meet me at the clinic in an hour." "And Davies?" She turned back to face him. "Not a word to Reverend Pike. Not yet." The next few hours were the longest of Margaret's life. Working by lamplight in Dr. Webb's abandoned clinic, she carefully prepared the herbal remedies exactly as Tall Bear had shown her. The measurements had to be precise. Too little, and the medicine would be ineffective. Too much, and it could be dangerous. She started with little Billy Thompson, whose fever had spiked so high that his mother had given up hope. Margaret mixed the willow bark tea with honey to mask the bitter taste and held the cup to his cracked lips. "This tastes funny," Billy mumbled, his eyes unfocused with delirium. "I know, sweetheart," Margaret said softly, smoothing his sweat-soaked hair. "But it's going to help you feel better. I promise." Within an hour, Billy's fever had broken for the first time in 3 days. By midnight, he was sitting up and asking for water. Word spread quickly through the surviving population of Silverbrook. Margaret treated Mrs. Patterson's baby with pine needle extract, carefully applied to the infant's pustules. She gave echinacea tea to the Johansson family, who had been slowly weakening with the early stages of infection. One by one, the people she treated began to show improvement. By dawn, she had successfully treated 15 patients. More importantly, none of them had gotten worse. Sheriff Davies cornered her as she was leaving the clinic, exhaustion making her stumble slightly. "I don't know what kind of medicine you're using," he said quietly, "but whatever it is, it's working better than anything Dr. Webb ever tried. Where did you learn this?" Margaret hesitated. She'd known this question was coming, but she still wasn't sure how to answer it. The truth would likely cause panic, but lies would eventually be discovered. "There's a healer camped by the river," she said finally. "Someone with knowledge of traditional remedies." Davies studied her face carefully. "What kind of healer?" "The kind that saves lives," Margaret replied firmly. "That's all that matters right now." But she knew it wouldn't be enough. The improvements in the patients were too dramatic, too sudden to be explained away as natural recovery. People would ask questions, and eventually those questions would reach Reverend Pike and the others who viewed any contact with Indians as consorting with the devil. She needed more time to prove that the treatments worked, more success stories that couldn't be ignored, and that meant continuing her secret collaboration with Tall Bear. The next night, she returned to the Lakota camp with 3 desperately ill patients, volunteers who were willing to risk everything for a chance at survival. Mary Hutchins, the mayor's wife, who had been unconscious with fever for 2 days. Young Samuel Brooks, whose pustules had become so infected that conventional wisdom said he was beyond saving. And old Joe Mitchell, who had been begging someone to end his suffering. Tall Bear and Grandmother Singing Bird worked through the night, applying poultices, administering herbal treatments, and performing healing rituals that Margaret watched with fascination rather than fear. There was a precision to their movements, a deep understanding of the human body and its relationship with the natural world that made Dr. Webb's limited bag of tricks seem primitive by comparison. "Your people think healing is about fighting the sickness," Tall Bear explained as he carefully applied a pine needle compress to Samuel's infected pustules. "But true healing is about helping the body remember how to be strong." Margaret watched his hands move with gentle confidence over the boy's inflamed skin. There was something almost hypnotic about the way he worked, completely focused, entirely present in the moment. She found herself studying the lines of his face in the firelight, the way his long hair fell across his shoulders, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him like warmth. "You're staring," he said, without looking up from his work. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm learning," she protested. "Learning what? How to prepare golden seal root? Or how to read the thoughts behind a man's eyes?" The teasing note in his voice made her heart skip unexpectedly. Over the past 2 days, she'd begun to see past the warrior exterior to the man beneath. Someone who had suffered tremendous loss, but had chosen to channel his pain into healing rather than revenge. Someone who treated her as an equal, despite the vast differences in their backgrounds. "Both, perhaps," she said quietly. This time he did look up, and their eyes met across the small fire. For a moment, the space between them seemed charged with possibilities that neither had dared to voice. "Margaret," Tall Bear said softly, "there is something you must understand. If your people discover what we are doing here—" "They won't," she said quickly. "I'm being careful." "Are you?" He set down his work and turned to face her fully. "Because there are already whispers in your town. Traders who come to our camp speak of talk about witchcraft, about unnatural healing. Your medicine man with the black robes is asking questions. Margaret's stomach dropped. She'd known Reverend Pike would eventually become suspicious, but she'd hoped for more time. What kind of questions? He wants to know where you learned your new medicines. He speaks of evil spirits and corruption of Christian souls. Tall Bear's expression grew serious. He also speaks of punishment for those who traffic with savages. The word savages hung in the air between them like a slap. Margaret had heard it used so casually, so automatically, that she'd almost stopped noticing it. But hearing it in reference to this man who had shown her nothing but respect and kindness made her realize how poisonous the term really was. "You're not savages," she said fiercely. "You're healers. You're saving lives while our own supposedly civilized doctor ran away like a coward." Tall Bear smiled sadly. "Your words honor us, but they will not change the minds of your people. To them, we will always be the enemy. And you." He reached out and touched her hand, sending unexpected warmth up her arm. "You risk becoming the enemy too, just for standing beside us." Margaret looked around the camp, where Grandmother Singing Bird was chanting softly over old Joe Mitchell while applying a healing compress to his chest. Mary Hutchins was already sitting up and sipping herbal tea, color returning to her cheeks for the first time in days. Samuel Brooks was sleeping peacefully, his infected pustules clearly beginning to heal. These people had welcomed her despite having every reason to hate and distrust her. They had shared their most sacred knowledge, asked for nothing in return except that she learn properly and treat the medicine with respect. And now one of them was offering to risk his own safety to continue helping her people. "Then I'll just have to make them understand," she said finally. "I'll make them see what I've seen. That healing has no color, no nationality. That suffering doesn't care about the differences between us." Tall Bear's grip on her hand tightened slightly. "And if they refuse to see? If they choose fear over wisdom?" Margaret met his gaze steadily, feeling something shift inside her chest, a certainty she hadn't felt since before the plague came to Silverbrook. "Then I'll choose wisdom over fear," she said, "even if I have to choose it alone." But as she spoke the words, she realized she wouldn't be alone. Not anymore. Whatever happened next, whatever challenges they faced, she would have this alliance, this friendship, this growing something more that she wasn't quite ready to name. The third night brought even more dramatic results. Margaret returned to town with Mary Hutchins walking on her own power, Samuel Brooks' infections completely cleared, and old Joe Mitchell declaring himself ready to return to work. The success was so complete, so undeniable, that even the most skeptical townspeople had to admit something extraordinary was happening. But it also meant that her secret was getting harder to keep. "There's going to be a town meeting tomorrow night," Sheriff Davies warned her as she prepared to leave for another session with Tall Bear. "Reverend Pike is demanding answers about your miraculous cures. He's been stirring up talk about ungodly practices and dark magic." Margaret felt a familiar chill of fear, but underneath it was something new, a steel resolve that surprised her with its strength. "Let him talk," she said. "When people are dying, results matter more than rhetoric." But even as she spoke the words, she knew the real test was coming. Soon she would have to choose between the safety of secrecy and the courage of truth, between the approval of her community and the alliance that had become precious to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. As she rode out toward the river camp under cover of darkness, Margaret whispered a prayer to whatever forces governed the healing arts, whether they were called God or the Great Spirit or something else entirely. She prayed for wisdom, for courage, and for the strength to do what was right even when the cost became clear. Because she was beginning to suspect that saving Silverbrook might require sacrificing everything she had ever been taught about the world and her place in it. The town meeting was called for 7 o'clock, but by 6:30 every surviving resident of Silverbrook had crowded into the church. Margaret arrived to find the small building buzzing with nervous energy, voices rising and falling in heated whispers that died the moment she walked through the door. Reverend Pike stood at the pulpit, his black robes making him look like a raven perched over carrion. His pale eyes found Margaret immediately, and she saw something cold and calculating in his gaze that made her skin crawl. "Brothers and sisters," Pike began, his voice carrying easily through the packed church, "we gather tonight to address a matter of grave spiritual concern. For the past 3 days, we have witnessed what some might call miraculous healings. The sick have been restored to health. The dying have been pulled back from death's door. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Margaret spotted Billy Thompson sitting with his mother in the front row, his cheeks pink with health. Behind them, Mary Hutchins held her husband's hand, looking stronger than she had in weeks. Samuel Brooks gave Margaret a shy wave from across the room. "Now I ask you," Pike continued, his voice growing louder, "what power on this earth can accomplish such wonders? What force can reach into the very jaws of death and snatch souls back to life?" "God's power," someone called out from the back. "Divine intervention," added another voice. Pike nodded slowly, but his expression remained stern. "Indeed, brothers and sisters, only the Lord our God possesses such might. Only through his grace and mercy can such miracles occur." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the assembled townspeople. "But what if I told you that these healings were not wrought by the hand of the Almighty?" The murmur grew louder, more agitated. Margaret felt her heart begin to race. "What if I told you," Pike continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the church, "that these so-called miracles were accomplished through communion with the forces of darkness, through trafficking with godless heathens who practice the black arts?" The whispers exploded into shocked exclamations. Margaret saw heads turning in her direction, faces that had looked at her with gratitude just hours before now, showing confusion and suspicion. Sheriff Davies stood up from his seat near the front. "Reverend Pike, that's a serious accusation. Do you have proof of what you're suggesting?" Pike's thin lips curved into what might have been a smile. "I have the testimony of God-fearing men who have seen with their own eyes. Brother Jensen, would you please stand and tell the congregation what you witnessed 2 nights ago?" A middle-aged farmer rose reluctantly from his seat, his weathered hands twisting his hat nervously. Margaret recognized him as Lars Jensen, whose farm bordered the path to the river. "Well," Jensen said slowly, his voice barely audible, "I was out checking my traps, you understand. Couldn't sleep with all the worry about the sickness. And I saw Miss Margaret there, riding past my place in the dead of night. Had some folks with her, sick folks, from the look of them." "Where was she going, Brother Jensen?" Pike prompted. "Toward the river, toward where them Indians are camped." The explosion of voices was immediate and furious. Margaret felt the temperature in the room seem to drop as dozens of eyes turned toward her with expressions ranging from shock to betrayal to outright anger. "Order!" Mayor Hutchins called out, banging his walking stick against the floor. "Let's hear what Margaret has to say before we jump to conclusions." But Pike wasn't finished. "Brother Morrison, please share what you observed yesterday evening." Another man stood, Jack Morrison, the town's part-time blacksmith. His face was flushed with excitement and righteous indignation. "I followed her," Morrison said loudly. "Figured something strange was going on, what with all these sudden cures. So I tracked her to that Indian camp, and I saw—" He paused dramatically. "I saw her kneeling before a heathen medicine man while he painted symbols on her face and chanted in their devil tongue." Margaret's blood turned to ice. She remembered the evening Morrison was talking about. Tall Bear had been teaching her about the spiritual aspects of healing, explaining how the Lakota connected physical wellness to spiritual balance. The symbols had been simple dots of clay mixed with healing herbs, applied to acupressure points to help focus the body's natural healing energy. But she knew how it must have looked to someone watching from the shadows. "Furthermore," Morrison continued, his voice growing more excited, "I saw her giving our sick people over to this savage for his ungodly rituals. Our own neighbors, handed over to be corrupted by heathen magic." The church erupted into chaos. Voices shouted over each other, some demanding explanations, others calling for immediate action. Margaret tried to stand, tried to speak, but the noise was overwhelming. "Witch!" someone screamed from the back of the church. "She sold her soul to the devil. What about our children? Has she corrupted them too?" Margaret finally managed to get to her feet, her voice cutting through the din. "Stop," she shouted. "Just stop and listen to me." The crowd quieted somewhat, but the atmosphere remained charged with hostility. Margaret looked around the room at faces she'd known for years, people she'd helped, people she'd shared meals with, people she'd considered friends. Now they looked at her like she was a stranger, or worse. "Yes," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the church. "I've been working with the Lakota healer. His name is Tall Bear, and he's the reason half of you are still alive." The whispers started again, but Margaret pressed on. "When Dr. Webb ran away and left us to die, when your prayers and your conventional medicine failed to save a single life, I found someone who could help. Someone with knowledge that goes back generations, knowledge that your precious civilized medicine couldn't match." "Heathen knowledge," Pike interjected. "Satanic practices." "Healing knowledge," Margaret shot back. "Billy Thompson, stand up." The boy looked confused but obeyed, rising slowly from his seat beside his mother. "3 days ago, this child was dying," Margaret said loudly. "His fever was so high that Dr. Webb declared him beyond saving before he ran away like a coward. Reverend Pike gave him last rites. His own mother had given up hope." She gestured toward Billy, whose cheeks were now rosy with health. "Does he look corrupted by Satan to you?" Mrs. Thompson clutched her son protectively, but uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "Mary Hutchins," Margaret continued, turning toward the mayor's wife, "you were unconscious for 2 days. Your husband was digging your grave. Now look at you." Mary Hutchins stood slowly, her face pale but determined. "Margaret's right," she said quietly. "Whatever she did, whoever she learned it from, it saved my life." "And mine," added Samuel Brooks, getting to his feet. "My infections were so bad that folks said I'd be dead within hours. But that Indian healer, he knew exactly what to do. He treated me with more kindness than Dr. Webb ever showed." One by one, the people Margaret had treated began to stand. Old Joe Mitchell, who had been begging for death just days before. Mrs. Patterson holding her healthy baby. The Johansson family, all 5 of them restored to full health. But for every person who stood in support, 2 others remained seated, their faces hard with suspicion and fear. Reverend Pike raised his hands for silence. "Brothers and sisters, don't you see? This is exactly how Satan works. Through seemingly good deeds that lead us away from the true path, the devil himself can appear as an angel of light." "The only devil I see here," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger with righteous anger, "is the one that would rather let people die than admit that healing can come from unexpected places." Pike's face flushed red. "How dare you? I am a man of God, called to protect this flock from spiritual corruption. You're a man who stood by and watched children suffer while refusing to consider that maybe, just maybe, God works through more than just white Protestant doctors." The church fell silent. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat in her ears as she realized what she just said, how far she'd pushed things. But there was no going back now. Sheriff Davies stood up slowly. "Margaret," he said carefully, "I need to ask you directly. Are you working with the Lakota war party that's been reported in this area?" "They're not a war party," Margaret said firmly. "They're families, people trying to survive, just like us. And yes, I've been learning from their healer because he knows things our doctors don't." "But they're Indians," Davies said, as if that explained everything. "So what?" The words came out more forcefully than Margaret had intended, but she was past caring about propriety. "Their skin is a different color, so their knowledge doesn't count. Their children bleed the same red blood as ours. Their families mourn their dead the same way we do. And their medicine works when ours fails." Jack Morrison jumped to his feet. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. She's been seduced by these savages, turned against her own people." "I haven't been turned against anyone," Margaret replied. "I've been trying to save lives while the rest of you argued about whose prayers were more effective." Mayor Hutchins banged his walking stick again. "The question before us," he said heavily, "is what we do about this situation. Margaret has clearly been collaborating with Indians, which puts the entire town at risk." "At risk of what?" Margaret demanded. "At risk of learning something useful? At risk of surviving?" "At risk of attack," Morrison shouted. "Everyone knows you can't trust Indians. They're probably planning to massacre us all once we're healed up enough to be worth killing." Margaret felt a surge of protective fury that surprised her with its intensity. Tall Bear lost his wife and children to smallpox, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. He had every reason to hate white people, to want revenge. But when I came to him begging for help, he chose to heal instead of harm. He risked his own safety to save strangers who have never shown him anything but prejudice. She looked around the room, meeting as many eyes as she could. That man has shown more Christian charity than half the Christians in this room. Reverend Pike's face had gone purple with rage. Blasphemy, he hissed. Absolute blasphemy. Sheriff Davies, I demand that this woman be placed under arrest for practicing witchcraft and consorting with hostile Indians. The crowd erupted again, some voices supporting Pike's demand, others arguing in Margaret's defense. In the chaos, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. Fine, she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. You want to arrest me for saving lives? Go ahead. But know this, when the next outbreak comes, when your children are dying and your precious conventional medicine fails again, don't come looking for my help. She turned toward the door, then paused and looked back. And when you're burying more neighbors because you chose fear over wisdom, remember that you had a chance to learn something that could have made a difference. Margaret walked out of the church into the cool night air, leaving behind a community torn between gratitude and terror, between survival and superstition. Behind her, she could hear the shouting growing louder, angrier. Soon she knew they would come for her. But first, she had to warn Tall Bear. Margaret rode through the darkness as if the devil himself were chasing her, which wasn't far from the truth. Behind her, she could hear the angry voices from the church growing more organized, more dangerous. It wouldn't be long before they formed a proper mob and came looking for both her and Tall Bear. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the prairie grass and making her an easy target for anyone who might be following. But stealth was less important now than speed. She had to reach the Lakota camp before the townspeople did, had to warn Tall Bear that everything had changed. As she approached the river, Margaret could see the warm glow of the campfires through the cottonwood trees. The peaceful scene made her heart ache. Families gathered around their lodges, children playing in the firelight, elders sharing stories and wisdom. In a few hours, this tranquil setting might become a battleground. Tall Bear emerged from the trees before she'd even dismounted, moving with a silent grace that still amazed her. But when he saw her face in the moonlight, his expression immediately grew serious. What has happened? He asked, helping her down from her horse. They know, Margaret said breathlessly. About us, about the healing. Someone saw us, told the whole town. They're calling it witchcraft, saying I've been corrupted by Satan. Tall Bear's jaw tightened, but he didn't seem surprised. We knew this day would come. The question is, what will they do about it? Reverend Pike wants me arrested, and the way they were talking, Margaret shuddered. I think they're planning to come for you too. Tonight. Without hesitation, Tall Bear turned toward the camp and gave a low, carrying whistle, a signal that had the immediate effect of transforming the peaceful scene into organized activity. Within minutes, the Lakota had begun breaking down their lodges and packing their belongings with the efficiency of people who had moved many times before. You don't have to run, Margaret said desperately. We could try to explain, make them understand. Understand what? Tall Bear's voice was gentle but firm. That we are human beings who wish only to live in peace? That our medicine comes from the same earth that feeds their crops? That the Great Spirit who watches over us is not so different from the God they claim to serve? He gestured toward the camp, where Grandmother Singing Bird was directing the younger women in packing the medicinal herbs with careful precision. My people have tried to make your people understand for many generations, Margaret. We have signed treaties written on the white man's paper. We have shared our knowledge, our food, our land. And always, always, it ends the same way, with us being driven from places we have called home. Margaret felt tears burning behind her eyes. But you saved them. You saved their children. Doesn't that count for anything? Tall Bear reached out and touched her face, his fingers tracing the faded scars that his medicine had healed. It counts for everything to those who were saved, but fear is stronger than gratitude in the hearts of frightened people. Then come with me, she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. We'll go west to California, start over where no one knows us. For a moment, Tall Bear's eyes softened, and she saw something there that made her heart race, a longing that matched her own, a vision of what could be possible if the world were different. "And leave my people?" he asked quietly. "Leave grandmother's singing bird, who raised me after my parents died? Leave the children who depend on me to keep them safe?" Margaret closed her eyes, knowing he was right, but hating it anyway. She'd fallen in love. When had that happened? When had this alliance born of desperation become something deeper, something that made the thought of separation feel like a physical wound? "Then what do we do?" she whispered. Before Tall Bear could answer, the sound of hoofbeats reached them through the night air. Many hoofbeats, approaching fast. "They're coming," Margaret breathed. Tall Bear's hand moved to the knife at his belt, but Margaret caught his wrist. "No," she said firmly. "No violence. That will only prove them right." "Margaret," Tall Bear said urgently, "you need to leave. Now, if they find you here with us—" "I'm not running either," she interrupted. "This is my choice, my responsibility. I won't let you face this alone." The riders burst through the tree line in a cloud of dust and fury. Margaret counted at least 15 men, led by Sheriff Davies and Jack Morrison. Most carried rifles, and several had ropes hanging from their saddles, a sight that made Margaret's blood turn to ice. Reverend Pike rode at the back of the group, his black robes billowing behind him like the wings of a carrion bird. His pale eyes glittered with righteous satisfaction as they fixed on Margaret and Tall Bear standing side by side. "There she is," Morrison shouted, pointing an accusing finger. "Consorting with the enemy, just like we said." Sheriff Davies raised his hand for silence, but his face was grim with determination. "Margaret Hartwell," he called out, "by the authority of the town of Silverbrook, I'm placing you under arrest for practicing witchcraft and endangering the community through collaboration with hostile Indians." "Hostile?" Margaret stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "Look around you, Sheriff. Do you see any weapons? Any signs of aggression? These people are packing to leave peacefully, to spare your town any conflict." "Peaceful savages," Morrison sneered. "That's a contradiction if I ever heard one." Tall Bear moved to stand beside Margaret, his posture calm but alert. When he spoke, his English was careful and clear, pitched to carry to every man in the group. "I am Tall Bear of the Lakota people," he said formally. "I have taken no white scalps. I have stolen no white horses. I have harmed no white children. I have done nothing but share the healing knowledge of my ancestors with a woman who came to me begging for help to save her dying people." "Pretty word," Pike called out from the back of the group. "But we know your kind, savage. You speak of peace while you plan war." Margaret felt Tall Bear tense beside her, and she placed a restraining hand on his arm. "He saved your lives," she shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. "When your own doctor abandoned you, when your prayers weren't enough, this man risked everything to help complete strangers." "And corrupted your immortal soul in the process," Pike replied coldly. "Margaret, you've been seduced by the devil's false promises, but it's not too late. Renounce these heathen practices, return to the Lord's grace, and you can still be saved." Margaret looked around the group of mounted men, seeing faces she'd known for years twisted with fear and hatred. But she also saw uncertainty in some eyes, doubt in others. Not all of them were convinced that this was the right course of action. "Billy Thompson is alive because of this man's medicine," she said clearly. "Mary Hutchins is alive. Samuel Brooks is alive. 15 people who would have died are now healthy and whole. If that's the devil's work, then maybe we need to reconsider who we're really serving." "Blasphemy," Pike hissed, but Margaret wasn't finished. "You want to know what I've learned from the Lakota people?" she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I've learned that healing doesn't depend on the color of your skin or the language of your prayers. I've learned that wisdom can come from unexpected sources, and that sometimes the people we're taught to fear are the ones with the most to teach us." She gestured toward the camp, where families were quietly loading their belongings onto travois, preparing to abandon yet another home because of white fear and prejudice. "I've learned what real courage looks like," she said. "It looks like a man who lost his wife and children to the same disease that was killing us, choosing to heal instead of seeking revenge. It looks like a grandmother sharing sacred knowledge with strangers who have shown her people nothing but cruelty." Margaret turned to face Tall Bear, her decision crystallizing in her mind like ice forming on a winter pond. And I've learned what love looks like when it's not limited by the artificial boundaries we create to separate ourselves from each other. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Several of the men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, and Margaret saw Sheriff Davies' expression soften slightly. But Jack Morrison had heard enough. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he shouted, raising his rifle. "She's been completely corrupted, probably carrying his bastard child by now." "Morrison, stand down," Davies ordered, but the blacksmith was beyond listening to reason. "Indian lover," Morrison spat, swinging his rifle toward Tall Bear. "Time to put this savage down before he corrupts any more of our women." Everything happened at once. Morrison's finger tightened on the trigger. Tall Bear stepped protectively in front of Margaret, and Margaret, driven by an instinct stronger than fear, threw herself between the rifle and the man she'd come to love. The shot rang out across the river camp, echoing off the water and sending night birds screaming into the sky. But it was Morrison who fell, not Margaret or Tall Bear. Sheriff Davies' smoking pistol was still raised as the blacksmith toppled from his horse, clutching his shoulder and cursing loudly. "I said stand down," Davies repeated grimly. He looked around at the other men, his authority reasserted through decisive action. "This ends here. We came to arrest Margaret, not to start a massacre." Margaret found herself shaking as the adrenaline hit her system. Tall Bear's hand was warm and steady on her shoulder, grounding her in the moment. "Margaret Hartwell," Davies said formally, "you'll need to come with us to stand trial for your actions." Margaret looked around the camp one more time, at Grandmother Singing Bird, who gave her a small nod of approval, at the children peeking out from behind their mother's skirts, at Tall Bear, whose dark eyes held promises that no words could express. "I'll come," she said finally, "but not as a criminal. I'll come as someone who chose to save lives over preserving prejudice." She turned to Tall Bear, knowing this might be the last time she saw him for a long while, if ever. "The medicine," she said quietly, "the knowledge you've taught me, I'll find a way to use it to honor what you've shared." Tall Bear nodded solemnly. "The healing path is never easy, Margaret, but once you set foot upon it, it becomes part of who you are." He leaned close enough to whisper in her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "This is not goodbye," he said softly. "The connection between healers transcends the boundaries that other people create." Margaret climbed onto her horse, flanked by the remaining townsmen, but no longer feeling like their prisoner. She'd made her choice, declared her allegiance, and she would face whatever consequences came next. As they rode away from the camp, she heard Grandmother Singing Bird begin a low, keening song, a healing chant that seemed to follow them across the prairie like a blessing. Margaret's trial took place 3 days later in the same church where she'd made her fateful confession. But the atmosphere had changed dramatically since that heated confrontation. Word of Sheriff Davies' intervention at the river camp had spread quickly, along with detailed accounts of Margaret's passionate defense of the Lakota healer. More importantly, the epidemic had finally begun to subside. For the first time in over a month, no one in Silverbrook had died from smallpox in the past week. The last of the seriously ill patients, those treated with Tall Bear's herbal remedies, were showing steady improvement. Even Reverend Pike couldn't deny the correlation between Margaret's ungodly treatments and the town's miraculous recovery. The church was packed again, but this time the mood was more contemplative than angry. Margaret sat in the front row, flanked by Sheriff Davies and Mayor Hutchins, facing a panel of 5 judges, 3 town council members, Reverend Pike and Dr. Harrison Webb, who had finally returned from Fort Laramie the day before, claiming he'd been gathering medical supplies and reinforcements. Webb's return had caused quite a stir. The man who had abandoned Silverbrook in its darkest hour now sat at the judge's table, his medical bag prominently displayed, ready to resume his position as the town's official healer. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. "Margaret Hartwell," Mayor Hutchins began formally, "you stand accused of practicing unauthorized medicine, consorting with hostile Indians, and endangering the spiritual welfare of this community. How do you answer these charges?" Margaret stood slowly, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. She'd spent the past 3 days in the town jail, a converted storage room behind the general store, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. She'd had time to consider the path that lay ahead, to weigh her options and make peace with her choices. I answer that I saved lives, she said clearly. I answer that when conventional medicine failed and our trained physician abandoned us, I found another way. I answered that the only thing I'm guilty of is refusing to let people die when I knew how to help them. Dr. Webb shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Miss Hartwell, he said in his cultivated voice, surely you understand that medical practice requires proper training, proper qualifications. You can't simply what? Margaret interrupted, her patience finally snapping. Can't simply care more about results than credentials? Can't simply stay and fight when the going gets tough? She gestured toward the packed church, where many of the faces looking back at her belonged to people she treated. Dr. Webb, you declared Billy Thompson beyond saving before you ran away. He's sitting right there in the third row, healthy as a horse. You gave Mary Hutchins last rites. She's standing beside her husband, fully recovered. You took all the real medicine with you when you fled, leaving us with nothing but prayer and whatever folk remedies we could remember. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she spoke, filled with a conviction that surprised even her. So yes, I practiced unauthorized medicine. I learned from someone you'd call unqualified. And because of that unauthorized, unqualified medicine, 15 people are alive today who would otherwise be dead. But at what cost to your immortal soul, Reverend Pike interjected. Miss Hartwell, you've trafficked with heathens, participated in pagan rituals, abandoned the teachings of Christ for the superstitions of savages. Margaret turned to face the Reverend directly. Reverend Pike, in the Gospel of Matthew, Christ says, by their fruits ye shall know them. Well, what are the fruits of Tall Bear's medicine? Healed children, restored families, lives saved. She paused, letting her words sink in. What are the fruits of your righteousness? Division, fear, nearly starting a war with people who wanted nothing more than to help us. The church fell silent. Even Pike seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Sheriff Davies stood up slowly. If I may address the court, he said formally, I was present at the confrontation by the river 3 nights ago. I saw the Lakota camp with my own eyes. He turned to face the assembled townspeople. What I saw was a small group of families, maybe 30 people total, including children and elderly. They had no war paint, no weapons of aggression. When they saw us coming, they didn't prepare for battle. They packed their belongings and prepared to leave peacefully to avoid bloodshed. Davies paused, his weathered face grave with memory. I've fought Indians before, during the wars. I know what hostile intent looks like. What I saw at that camp was the exact opposite. People trying to avoid conflict even when they had every right to defend themselves. But there's still Indians, Jack Morrison called out from the back of the church, his wounded arm in a sling. You can't trust any of them. Morrison, Davies said sharply, you nearly started a massacre because of that kind of thinking. If I hadn't stopped you, we'd have innocent blood on our hands. Young Billy Thompson stood up suddenly, his clear voice carrying through the church. The Indian man who helped Miss Margaret heal me, he was nice to me. He gave me a wooden horse he carved himself and told me stories about brave warriors and wise animals. He didn't seem scary at all. Billy's mother tried to pull him back down, but other voices began to join in. Tall Bear treated my baby like she was his own granddaughter, Mrs. Patterson said, standing with her healthy infant in her arms. He was so gentle, so careful. I've never seen anyone work with such loving skill. He spent hours teaching Miss Margaret how to prepare the medicines properly, added Samuel Brooks. Hours of his time, freely given, asking nothing in return except that she learn to do it right. One by one, the people Margaret had treated began to share their experiences. The quiet dignity of the Lakota healer, his insistence on proper preparation and dosage, his genuine concern for each patient's well-being, the careful respect he'd shown for their fears and cultural differences. Dr. Webb grew increasingly uncomfortable as these testimonies accumulated. Finally, he stood up abruptly. Ladies and gentlemen, he said in his most authoritative voice, you're being seduced by primitive practices that may have worked in this isolated case, but lack any scientific foundation. Real medicine is based on proven principles, established procedures. Your proven principles failed, Margaret said quietly. Your established procedures couldn't save a single life. Because this was an unprecedented outbreak, Webb protested. The strain was particularly virulent, the infection rates unusually high. The mortality rate in our town was less than 10%, Margaret interrupted. Dr. Webb, you yourself said we should expect 30 to 70% mortality. The fact that we lost so few people isn't despite the Lakota medicine, it's because of it. A murmur ran through the church as people began to process this information. Margaret could see the moment when the mathematical reality hit them. Dozens of lives had been saved. Mayor Hutchins called for order, then looked gravely at the panel of judges. The question before us, he said slowly, is not whether Margaret's actions were conventional, but whether they were right. The question, Reverend Pike said firmly, is whether we will allow paganism and devil worship to take root in our Christian community. With respect, Reverend, Margaret said, if saving lives is devil worship, then maybe we need to examine what we think we know about good and evil. She stood and faced the assembled townspeople, her neighbors, her friends, her community. I'm not asking you to abandon your faith, she said clearly. I'm asking you to expand your definition of healing, to consider that maybe God works through more than just white Protestant doctors, to recognize that wisdom doesn't respect the artificial boundaries we create between peoples. Margaret paused, thinking of Tall Bear's gentle hands applying healing balms, of grandmother's singing birds' patient teaching, of the quiet courage it had taken for them to help strangers who had every reason to be their enemies. I've learned something over these past weeks, she continued. Healing isn't about religion or race, or whether your knowledge comes from a medical school or from generations of traditional practice. Healing is about love, love strong enough to bridge any divide, to overcome any prejudice, to risk anything for the sake of preserving life. The church was absolutely silent now, every person hanging on her words. So yes, I'm guilty of loving people enough to seek help wherever I could find it. I'm guilty of learning from teachers you don't approve of. I'm guilty of putting results ahead of ideology. Margaret looked directly at Dr. Webb. And I'm guilty of staying when others ran away. The deliberation lasted less than an hour. When the judges returned, Mayor Hutchins announced their decision with obvious relief. The charges against Margaret Hartwell are dismissed, he said formally. Furthermore, this court recognizes her contributions to the health and welfare of our community. We hereby appoint her as Silverbrook's official healer, with full authority to practice medicine in whatever manner she deems appropriate. The church erupted in applause, but Margaret barely heard it. She was thinking of Tall Bear, wondering where he was, hoping he was safe. Dr. Webb packed his bags and left town that very afternoon, muttering about backwards frontier thinking and the decline of civilization. Few people bothered to bid him farewell. Margaret established her practice in the old clinic, but she made significant changes. The shelves that had once held expensive patent medicines now displayed carefully labeled jars of herbal remedies. The treatment table was surrounded by hanging bundles of healing plants, and on the wall, she hung a beautiful Lakota medicine wheel that grandmother's singing bird had given her, a symbol of the wholeness that came from balancing traditional wisdom with modern knowledge. 3 months later, Margaret was treating a farmer's broken arm when she heard familiar hoofbeats outside. Her heart began to race even before she saw him, as if some part of her had been waiting for this moment all along. Tall Bear stood in the doorway of the clinic, looking exactly as she remembered, but somehow more real, more present. Behind him, she could see grandmother Singing Bird sitting on her horse, smiling with ancient wisdom. I heard there was a healer in this town who might be willing to learn more about traditional medicine, he said solemnly, though his eyes sparkled with suppressed joy. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face before she realized she was crying. I heard there was a teacher who might be willing to share more of his knowledge, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The path of the healer is long and difficult, Tall Bear said, stepping into the clinic and looking around at her blend of white and Lakota medicine. It requires great dedication, great sacrifice. I know, Margaret said, moving toward him as if drawn by an invisible force. It also requires partnership, he continued, his voice growing softer. Someone to share the burden, to learn alongside, to help carry the medicine to places it's never been before. Margaret was close enough now to see the love shining in his dark eyes, to feel the warmth radiating from his presence. "Are you asking me to be your partner?" she whispered. "I'm asking you to be my wife," Tall Bear said simply, "to join the Lakota people officially, to help me build a healing practice that bridges our two worlds." Margaret thought of everything she'd fought for, everything she'd risked, everything she'd learned about the true meaning of healing and love and courage. "Yes," she said, stepping into his arms at last. "Yes to all of it." Their wedding 3 weeks later was unlike anything Silverbrook had ever seen. A ceremony that blended Lakota traditions with frontier customs, presided over by both Grandmother Singing Bird and a surprisingly cooperative new reverend who had replaced Pike. Half the town attended, along with Tall Bear's extended family, creating a celebration that truly bridged two worlds. Margaret wore a white dress decorated with traditional Lakota beadwork. Tall Bear wore buckskin clothing adorned with blue ribbons. The color, Margaret had told him, represented healing in her culture. They exchanged vows in both English and Lakota, promising to honor each other's traditions while building something entirely new together. As they danced together under the prairie stars, surrounded by friends from both communities, Margaret marveled at how much had changed since that first desperate night when she'd ridden to the river seeking help. The epidemic was over. The town was thriving, and she had found not just a teacher or a partner, but a love that had grown from the deepest soil of shared purpose and mutual respect. "No regrets," Tall Bear murmured in her ear as they swayed to the music of fiddles and traditional drums. Margaret looked around at the celebration, at children playing together regardless of their heritage, at adults sharing food and stories across cultural lines, at a community that had learned to see healing as a gift that belonged to all humanity. "None at all," she said softly, meaning it with every fiber of her being. The plague healer had found her place at last, not in one world or the other, but in the bridge between them, where love and wisdom could flourish without boundaries. 5 years later, the healing clinic that Margaret and Tall Bear established in Silverbrook had become legendary throughout the Missouri River Territory. Travelers came from hundreds of miles away, seeking treatment that combined the best of both traditional Native American medicine and frontier medical practices. Their 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, grew up speaking both English and Lakota, learning to identify healing plants before they could properly read, and understanding that wisdom could come from any source if one's heart was open to receiving it. Margaret never forgot the lessons she'd learned during those dark weeks when smallpox threatened to destroy everything she held dear. She taught those lessons to anyone willing to listen, that healing transcends the artificial boundaries human beings create between each other, that courage sometimes means standing alone for what you know is right, and that love, true love, grows strongest when it's rooted in mutual respect and shared purpose. Tall Bear established a network of Native healers who worked quietly with frontier communities throughout the region, sharing traditional knowledge while learning from white medical practices that proved useful. The cultural bridge that had begun with desperate circumstances slowly grew into something revolutionary, a new model of cooperation that honored both traditions while creating something entirely unique. Grandmother Singing Bird lived to see her great-grandchildren playing with white children in the streets of Silverbrook, learning each other's languages and customs as naturally as breathing. She passed away peacefully at the age of 91, surrounded by family from both communities, her final words a blessing for the healing path that Margaret and Tall Bear had chosen to walk together. The town of Silverbrook prospered, becoming known as a place where differences were bridges rather than barriers, where healing knowledge flowed freely between cultures, and where the next generation grew up understanding that humanity's greatest strength lay in its diversity rather than its divisions. Margaret and Tall Bear's love story became the foundation for something much larger than either of them had ever imagined, a legacy of healing that would influence frontier medicine for generations to come. In the end, it wasn't the plague that defined their story, but the love and courage that grew from their determination to answer suffering with wisdom, fear with understanding, and hatred with hope, inspired by true events. In 1837, smallpox ravaged frontier settlements along the Missouri River, killing over 17,000 Native Americans and countless settlers. Many doctors fled infected areas, leaving communities to rely on traditional native healing methods. This story honors those who bridged cultural divides during America's darkest medical crisis and reminds us that wisdom, compassion, and love know no boundaries. The herbs and treatments depicted in this story, including willow bark, echinacea, golden seal, and pine needle extract, are based on actual traditional Native American medicines that have been scientifically proven to have healing properties. Many modern pharmaceuticals have their origins in the traditional plant medicines that indigenous peoples discovered and refined over thousands of years. Sometimes the greatest healing comes not from abandoning our differences, but from learning to see them as different facets of the same fundamental truth, that all human beings deserve dignity, respect, and the chance to contribute their unique gifts to the world. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history and heart. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, love has no boundaries, wisdom has no single source, and healing hands come in every color.